Uh,
I thought that was right on target.
well, thank you.
God, I love this sermon, this series, like I've told you.
Yeah, listen, they're all growing too, like overnight. Yeah, right, right. Yeah. Oh, imagine that, right? Yeah, yeah, right. I got. Yeah. So, my nephew, to be funny, when he graduated, I think I'm not sure what school it was over in Phoenix. It was either Glenwood or Smith Station, and you had to give a quote. And so his quote to joke around with his teachers, he said, "Everybody misunderestimates me." I thought it was pretty good. Yeah, that's pretty good. Yep. Well, I had my bell. I don't know what I did. Oh, it's in my pocket. All right. So we're pretty close. I know we might have a few others coming. So if you want to grab a cup of coffee, or if you're at home, you want to get another cup of coffee and give us a minute, we'll start up here in a second. As the year goes on, as in the school year, our start time is a little more delayed as we get into the winter, and sometimes you just don't want to get out of bed. I'm going to give y'all these two and let y'all start those around. Oh, hey. So, well, good morning and welcome. It's good to see y'all. Missed y'all last week, and I hope y'all had a good week. Uh, One of the things that you might have heard that we're doing or we're offering here, and I don't know if y'all are yoga people, like stretching and things of that nature. We do have yoga classes twice a day at St. Paul now. So there's actually, I think, there's actually one in process now, or progress now. So if you are, we're teaming up with, it's a Christian-based Yoga Redeem. Heather Cannon's her name. And so this is their first week here. So if that's, I don't mean, if you are interested in that, you can see Kathy on the way out. She has all the times. And anyway, I think that's all the announcements of that I know of right offhand. Um, you can.
I took flowers to Betty Simpson yesterday. This week is her 92nd birthday, and she had just come home from the beauty parlor, and she looked beautiful and talked like she always does. So if you want to call her or send her a card, she would be happy to listen.
So Betty Stinson's 92nd birthday. Wow, that's pretty good. Limited. Um, uh, I think with the aid of her son, she gets out some, but not. She doesn't get out herself that much. Just, I think on Sunday mornings, coming up in small groups, we're going to start those for 6 weeks. That's going to begin the week of February 5th. Those interested in either forming a small group or being in a small group, you can let myself or Teresa or Kathy know. It's just going to be for 6 weeks, and we put this curriculum together called Following Jesus. It's sort of a complement. We've sort of just added from a number of different authors. It's not like the Max Lucado. We will do Max Lucado again in the fall. That'll be a 10 to 12 weeks, similar to what we did this past fall. And then John Few and Gil McBride are going to do a short series on Sunday mornings during the Sunday school hour, and that'll begin February the 26th on the Screw Tape Letters. So that's C.S. Lewis, sort of a fictitious story between like an older demon and a younger demon, Wormwood and Screwtape. Uncle Screwtape writing to like his nephew Wormwood, and then there's sort of this correspondence, and it's a neat little thing. If you never read it, it's worth reading. But they're going to take it thematically, because there's a number of little letters and chapters in the book, and so they're going to, I think, maybe pick on 6 or 7 of the main themes of it, and then sort of teach on those. So I know some Sunday school classes are devoting their time to that when it begins, but that'll be in the fellowship hall beginning February the 26th. So there's no, you don't have to sign up or anything like that. If you, but, we want to make sure we have enough seats. So if you plan on coming, just or if your class is planning on coming, just if you wouldn't mind letting Grace or John or somebody like that know. All right. Any other announcements? All good? Sure. Yeah. So this was the preschool teacher that's here that her son and daughter were hit in the car accident a number of months ago. Her son, he's in the middle of the rehab. Now this is probably at least a month old since I went down to see him. But he's slowly coming back into normal functioning. No, he's here. He's back home. Yeah. So, but slowly introducing him back in, because I think there was some cognitive memory loss, and then some PTSD, things like that. That if you can imagine. So little by little, they're and he might be back to full schedule. I mean, but this would have been definitely before Christmas. Yeah. So, but still, there is some memory loss, and then a little bit of motor functioning, and seeing how that goes. Yeah, she does. Mm-hmm. Oh, you can't? So how about now? Is that better? Yeah, all right. So the question was around Nikki's son, Lapri, and his development. And just little by little, he's coming back to, but this was the last information I got was before Christmas, but still is, I think, some memory loss. They're still working on some of those finer skills that, just as you can imagine from an incident like that, could be in jeopardy or lost. But he is home, has been home for some time, and I think they're healing as best as they can. But appreciate St. Paul's love and care of them, and that was very generous and very kind and loving from this community, and I think that's been very helpful for them going forward. All right, any other announcements? All good. Did y'all hear the one about screw tape letters? Did you hear that? All right, good. All right, well, welcome if you're at home. And Betty Hips, I know she sent out the email, so prayer requests, feel free to list those, and she'll compile those between the electronic versions and then the pad that's going around. And then there also should be a sign-up sheet for refreshments if somebody wants to take a week there. So, all right, well, let's pray and we'll jump back in. Oh God, as we gather in your name for this, we are grateful. We pray, oh Lord, for your blessings and guidance and your presence here. What we're after is when we study the Bible every week, Lord, we want to know what it says, but at the same time, we want it to be applied to our life so that what's created is a transformation, is something that reflects the image of Christ. That's actually the goal of all things, that we would reflect you in the world. So use these disciplines that we have, leverage those in a way, however you see fit, so that we grow and we mature in our faith. We know that affects how we think, how we speak, how we act. All of this we lay before you. We are mindful of the concerns that we have, oh God, not just the people that we've mentioned, but obviously the war in Ukraine and the people who are in harm's way there. Watch over them, oh God, we ask in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, so back to Daniel 8, and I want to recap us a little bit, and then we'll jump in and finish the rest of the chapter. And then if we can get into chapter 9, I think that would be helpful. Now, we're not going to go deep into chapter 9 because that's its own issue and own vision or dream in and of itself, and it's going to take a little bit of time to unpack that. But we do want to finish 8. So since it's been a couple of weeks for us, the book of Daniel is divided into two main halves. The first half is more historical. That's chapters 1 through 6. Those are those stories that we're very familiar with. The fiery furnace, the lion's den. It's the Daniel over the span of about 80 years for Daniel. And with the exception of, I think, chapter, 3 or 4 that has to do with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the rest of it has to do with Daniel. And Daniel and a number of others were deported when they were young, probably about 13. This is under the direction of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire. They deported a number of the young, best and brightest. They somewhat indoctrinated them into the Babylonian way. And Nebuchadnezzar was king or ruler for about, I think, 60-something years of Daniel's life, and I think 63 to be exact. And then there were a number of kings after, or no, maybe Nebuchadnezzar was a little like 43 years, and then there were a number of kings that were after Nebuchadnezzar, maybe 10, 12, and they lasted about 20 years. Eventually, the Persians, or the Medes and the Persians, they become one empire. They overtake and destroy the Babylonians, and so the Persians ruled for a long time, long after Daniel, but eventually, under the Persian rules of either Darius or Cyrus, that most scholars believe that's one and the same person. Darius being the Mede name and Cyrus being the Persian name. And it was common in the ancient world that if you either assumed or overtook another empire, then you would with that would maybe overtake their names and things like that. And so the Medes and the Persians are sort of friends, and then eventually the Persians overtake the Medes, and and so Darius and Cyrus, basically most scholars believe they're one and the same person. Under Cyrus, he allows the Israelites to return back to Jerusalem. And so that's a big thing. And he actually, Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah is about part of that return. And Nehemiah is the cupbearer to the king of Persia. And eventually they allow him to return back to Israel, to Jerusalem, to reestablish the city wall, to reestablish the city, to reestablish the temple. And that takes place over a number of decades. But at the end of Daniel's life, and Nehemiah would have been a part of that, they're allowed to return. But the Persians go on for, a long time. I think it's 100 and something years. Eventually, the Greeks are the next group or the next empire that is sort of the biggest person in the neighborhood. Philip, Alexander the Great's father, has the reins with the Greeks for a short amount of time. I think it's maybe like 8 or 10 years. He dies. His son, Alexander the Great, takes over. And within a span of about 10 or 12 years, Alexander the Great annihilates the Persians. And so the Greeks then actually extend their empire from, pretty much the better part of Europe all the way over to India. And eventually they rule for a little bit, and then you have the Romans. And when Alexander the Great died, his empire is divided amongst 4 of his major generals. And so they basically just took geographical areas. And this was maybe, in the 160s BC, 170s, somewhere in that, between, 200 BC and 100 BC. And what they do is they fight for power. And so they're all this skirmishing going on. Eventually, one general or 2 generals win out. They are the beginnings of the Roman Empire. And then eventually the Romans establish themselves, and they rule for a long time. And basically to about maybe 400 AD, roughly. You have some crumbling, starts to crumble around 276. I think that's as the Visigoths sack Rome. I can't believe I still remember this. But anyway, that's where we're at. So these visions take place in Daniel's life. The first 2, chapter 7 and chapter 8, take place in the time of Daniel's life, what we would know from the book of Daniel, between chapter 7 and chapter 4 and chapter 5. Chapter 4 is the end of the Babylonians. Chapter 5 is, the Persians. So these visions, at least 7 and 8, chapter 7 and 8, the first 2 take place in between that time period. And that's a number of years. Not a lot, but a number. Maybe, 2-3 years before, timeline. When we get to chapter 9, that's after later on. But for 8, remember the first vision in 7 is the different animals. You got the 4 animals. It's one animal after the other, and what most scholars believe, and I think they're right, is Daniel is seeing the different empires that will come. When we get to 8, it's between these 2 animals. You have a ram and a goat, and we do know from history, ram represents the Medes and the Persians, and the goat represents Alexander the Great. You've got a ram that's pretty much just in full power in the pasture, in the land, wherever he goes. And then all of a sudden there's a goat that rises up. The goat is quick, has a horn, kills the ram. The ram cannot withstand the power of the goat. but then the horns of the goat, the one breaks, and then there are four, and so I mean, it's from history, it's easy to put these two people or these two empires in place. What gets difficult is when the angel gives interpretation to what happens after the goat. And that's what we have at the end of chapter 8, where we stopped 2 weeks ago. But the vision is Daniel's in Susa, in the citadel. Whether he was actually there physically or that's where the vision, where he sees himself in the vision, we don't know. To some degree, it doesn't matter. But it does play out this idea of there's a ram, then there's a goat that overtakes. Eventually the goat dies, and you have these four horns. And then inside of those four horns, there's another horn that comes up. Most scholars would, and this what they're doing is they're looking at what is said in the vision and then applying it to different parts. Where do they see that in history? It's in 175 BC, and Antichus, what is that? And Antiochus is a ruler, eventually from one of those generals of what we know as Syria. And he is just a brutal, brutal man. So if you think of where Syria's here, the Mediterranean's here, Lebanon, and then down into Jerusalem, part of what we know about his reign, and it lasted for, 12 years, is he did horrible things to the Israelites and to Jerusalem. He set up a big statue of Zeus in the temple. All right, so just think of your Old Testament, Pentateuch, first 5 books of the Old Testament. That's like a serious no-no. And in the holy city, in the holiest place in the holy city, the temple, you're going to put you're going to put a statue of Zeus in there. He outlawed all the ceremonial practices for the Israelites, made them, took away dietary issues. They had to eat certain food. That's the only food that they got. I mean, he just killed thousands. And the Maccabees, so some of you have a Bible that has more than just the Protestant canonical books. You have 1st and 2nd, I think 3rd and 4th Maccabees. 1st and 2nd Maccabees give some insight into this guy. And so most scholars think that the historical person that Daniel is writing about, or at least the time, which would be 400 years in the future of Daniel's life, is this guy right here. Now, this brings up one of the struggles with this type of genre of writing. And because there are some things that are always consistent about this style of writing. One, what's always stressed is the sovereignty of God. And you see that in every page of the book of Daniel. You see that in every page of the book of Revelation. What's not questioned is God's sovereignty. And whether it be the giver of wisdom, whether it be the one who either installs or removes kings. You see that in the book of Daniel. You see that in the book of Revelation. So one of the characteristics of this apocalyptic style of writing is the sovereignty of God. That is stressed because whatever happens, there's a note of encouragement, or it's meant to be encouraging in the face of some type of persecution. So every apocalyptic book in the Bible, and there's only a few, are all written at a time and for a time of persecution. And it normally involves dreams and visions, and with those dreams and visions, it always comes with some type of interpretation given from somebody other than a human. And what's stressed is be encouraged, even in the face of persecution, because God is sovereign. All right, so, but it always involves a historical person. And every historical person that these types of letters in the Bible portray is they're seen as incredibly evil. All right, so when we're going to read the second half of chapter 8, you're going to see this guy's just, he's not a nice guy. So here is the rub, or at least one of the two rubs when it comes to interpretation. The first one is it only this historical person, or is it an historical person who has the characteristics of an antichrist or an anti-God person, or is it what we call in theology the antichrist? All right, so we've talked a little bit about this in previous lessons. So it could be one of the three, all right? And so that's where scholars argue, and where we argue in our interpretation. Is Daniel chapter 8 talking about this historical person? What we know from history would tell us, yes, this fits the bill. And so is this person like many other people in history that rules anti of God, and that has its own levels of how they, because this is every antichrist person, whether it be the antichrist or an antichrist, has these characteristics. So when you read in the book of Daniel, when it talks about this guy here, he's going to be described this way. When you read in the book of Revelation about Antichrist and Revelation, he or she or that person is going to be described this way as well. These are common to all apocalyptic letters or writings. So there's some who would say Daniel in chapter 8, he's talking about this guy specifically. The fact that this guy fits this bill, then that's okay. He can be seen as an antichrist or the antichrist, but he definitely is a historical person that fits everything that Daniel did describe. Because it involves dreams and visions, and it's harder to interpret, there's some that move outside of the historical person and look at it in a sort of like a thematic type way, and so then you get these people. Does that make sense? All right? So let me stop and ask questions, because this is one of the first struggles whenever we read and study parts of the Bible that are written in this genre. All good? Wow. Go ahead.
I have never heard the idea of an antichrist.
Right.
And to me, that's a good interpretation, because during World War II, goodness, there was a lot of the whole world felt
So,
the Lord was the Antichrist.
if you read about commentaries of people reading the Bible in that time period, they would have associated him with either this or that. Yeah. But, so this is where people land either as a or an or the, has everything to do with the second issue that's a struggle. So the first issue is the person. The second issue is the time. When? Because it is future-based. Now, Daniel might be writing at a time of persecution. And so he could be writing to encourage the people of his day, or he could be writing to encourage the people in this day, or he could be writing to encourage the people in a very future day. So, I mean, again, that's where the struggle is. And you're going to find people, and you're going to find really, really good biblical scholars that come down in all of these camps. This, short-term prosperity. Short-term, he thrives for a little bit of time. A master of intrigue or a deceiver. He has great power, destroyed many. Short-term prosperity, which means his rule is pretty powerful, but only for a limited amount of time. He does persecute or persecuted saints, and he's proud, arrogant, and part of that characteristic there is that he blasphemes God. So this is true in Daniel, and it's also going to be true if you were to read the book of Revelation. So the real struggle is Daniel talking about this guy who had all these as a characteristic? Is Daniel talking about any person in history that has these characteristics? Or is Daniel talking about way off into the future of someone not yet, alive or whatever that will have these characteristics? And the church is going to be divided, like the Big C church is going to be divided around that. For me personally, chapter 8, okay, now there'll be others who disagree. For me personally, I think he's talking about this guy right here. The fact that he fits this bill, which has similar characteristics with this, then I think you could call him an antichrist because he fits the bill. If it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, then it must be a duck, right? So, if he walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then he would be a duck. Now, whether or not he is who knows? I don't know. Probably not. If you see it all as future-based, then, not, who knows? I have a view of Revelation that is not so future, like 1,000 years in the future or whatever it may be. How I interpret Revelation is that John is writing to his community because there's a new emperor who is persecuting the church, and so he wants to stress these things in his writing under the influence of God, and so he's describing 115 A.D. But now John Few would take a different view. And John would say a little bit more of the future part. And so it's on one level, it's important to know and to study and maybe debate or argue or push back and forth. But what's common to all three of these, and this is what you really, really, really need to just sort of get. What's common to all three is this right here. Because whether or not you're describing 175 BC, whether or not you're describing 1945, whether or not you're describing 3021, 3021, I'm just making that up, all right? So, I'm not trying to give you the date, because everybody gives a date, where the Mayans are counting. The Shane calendar says 3023, right? So, but whatever you're describing, this still plays. And in all of this style of writing, whenever God, what's interesting is you got these people that are anti of God who push against God's kingdom. And a lot of times that's portrayed in vision language. You got symbolic language, things of that nature. Like in Revelation, you got bowls, you got trumpets, you got seals, and but whenever God has had enough, it's like he just shoos to fly away. Well, it really is from one page to the next. In Revelation, as you're building up to what you think is going to be this this long battle that's going to go on forever, and you turn the page and they're already singing the victory song. And you're like, hang on, wait, there wasn't even a first shot. That's really it, all right? So I think, was that 19 to 20 in Revelation, or 20 to 21? They're leading up to all this. You just think, okay, now you get this epic battle, and and then you think it's going to go on for chapters, and you turn the page, and it's, all right, we're done. So could you imagine if you were watching a movie like that? For the first hour of the 2-hour movie, you're expecting this great battle scene that's going to go on for an hour and all this, and all of a sudden, immediately it's the credits. That's really what it's like when you read the book of Revelation. So, and the same here. When his reign is over in the vision, it's like, all right, it's done. He dies, not by human hands. He just dies, and wait a minute, this guy was supposed to be, he was doing all these horrible things and had all this power, and it's like, yeah, I've had enough. So now if you're in the middle of that, so this can be encouraging. Because what you don't want to do is lose hope or lose faith. So, anyways, I'm going to open it up to questions, because this is, this sort of divides the house in some form or fashion.
What's that guy's name? What's that IU after it?
Pardon me?
Looks like he has an IU.
Oh, that's the fourth. Sorry, my bad. All right, so, yeah. Yeah. All right, let's do this. How about that? Yeah, so, my bad. Yeah, IV, he probably needed an IV, right? Yeah. So actually, he actually died, this is historically true, he died of a broken heart. He grieved himself to death because for about 11 years, he's unstoppable. And then all of a sudden, he just he loses in defeat. And he goes in his tent and pretty much just, the next thing you know, he's dead. And there's so many, let's read it and then we'll jump in. All right, let's do that. How about that? So, I don't know what's going on with my phone. All right. So, I want to highlight one thing. I think we ended last time in verse 19, or what we'll do is we'll probably start, we ended at verse 18. So, but I do want you to look at verse 12. I think it's verse 12. Somebody read what they have for verse 12. Chapter 8.
The cause of rebellion, the host of the saints, and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground.
Right. So the reason I want to stop here is because one of the things that we're going to have to figure out is, to what level does judgment come into play? Because what verse 12 describes is that there's some level of a rebellion. And I think, Kay, your version said the rebellion of the saints. So one of the questions that we will ask of the text is that, what type of rebellion? Are these Israelites who were not obedient to God, and because of that, then this guy comes? Or is Daniel describing the people who follow him? They are in rebellion. I'm on, most, and I think it has to do with, there was a period of time in Israel's history where they were not obedient, and then somehow that ended in some level of tragedy. Now, stick a pin in it, because we're going to get to either, to what level does disobedience lead to judgment? And is that something that God causes, or is that just something that God allows people to live into their consequences? So is it one God caused or one God allows? All right, so we're just hang on to it. But that's a question, because the reason why I asked this is that I wanted you to see that in verse 12, is because in verse 18 through the rest of the chapter, the angel is going to give interpretation. So I've described the vision. That's where we left it 2 weeks ago. And then we have, as typical to this style of writing, you have an angel. We know his name. His name is Gabriel. And Gabriel gives interpretation to Daniel. That begins in verse 18. So if somebody would be so bold to read verses 18 through 26. No takers. All right. All right, go ahead, Kay. Kay gets a star, gold star today.
While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep, deep sleep. and raised me to my feet. He said, I'm going to tell you what happened later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the king of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece. The large horn between his eyes is the first king. The four The four horns that replace the one that was broken off represents four kingdoms that will emerge from this nation, but will not have the same power. In the latter part of the reign, when the rebels have become completely wicked, stem-faced king and matter of intrigue will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the mighty men and the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper. He will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take a stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power.
All right, thank you. So, again, you see, at least in some form, and your Bibles might have different words, these characteristics that show up with this one guy who's, the angel does tell us that obviously the ram, Medes and Persians, and then the goat are the Greeks. But we do know that just from history, Alexander the Great conquered the Persians in like 12 years, and then he died young, like 33 or 36 or something, and that his four generals did fight. So history can tell us, we can pinpoint not just the Greeks, but what time in Greek history. We also know from history that those four generals, so, if you've got like General A, B, C, and D, they have their own unique histories of fighting amongst their regions. So Alexander the Great had them all, but then when he dies, they divide up the kingdom, and there's fighting amongst all of that. Eventually, in Syria, there is this guy, but he's not one of the four major generals. He's actually really sort of a weakling type person when he first comes on the scene, but he's pretty savvy. That eventually he, in a few years, he rises up to become a king of one of these four areas. Now that all took place in this time right here, and we do know that he ruled until 163. So history, we can put these pieces together. Now the angel tells us a little bit, but from Medes and Persians, then the Greeks. But inside the Greek history, just what we know about their rulers and the battles and we can easily put those pieces together. So there was a historical person who lived at this time who fits this bill. And again, this guy was, he was brutal. But because time is one of the hard questions to answer, look at verse 19. All right? So verse 19, so the angel said, Daniel fell into a deep sleep. He was on the ground. The angel touched him, made him stand up. And then verse 19, behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. In Hebrew and in Old Testament language, that can describe something well off in the future, or it can describe a set portion of time, even if it's a past history to us. So there's two types of time in the Bible. One of them is kind of like our watch, chronos, chronological time. The other one is kairos, and kairos is not tied to like days and minutes and even sometimes years. It describes an appointed time or a complete time. And so when you have this language here in Daniel where the angel is describing this appointed time has come to an end, well, that could be this time. That could be describing a time in the future, or it could be describing something way off in the future. I think context describes him. Because, and this goes back to where I told you to put a pin in something, one of the things we have to ask is, well, what led to this guy coming on the scene? Well, we do get some insight from verse 12 and from verse, was it 20? Shane, why don't you write it down? Where it talks about the sinfulness of the people. Y'all see that in the passage? I know verse 12 talked about the rebellion of the saints. Shaney. Let me look at my notes. The sinfulness or the disobedient of the people. Yes, where does it say that?
In verse
23. All right, so we have it in verse 12. We also have it in 23. 23 says, "And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall rise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power, and he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are" what? That's right. So verse 12, verse 23, and verse 24 at least gives us some contextual clues that one of the either precursors or maybe reasons that led to this guy coming into power, or at least he came into power after a period of disobedience by the saints or by the holy people. So who would the holy people be? If you're Daniel. That's right, Israelites. Your people. Now, again, because it's a little bit of a time issue, is Daniel describing his people? That would be, here, or is he describing people that would be God's people in maybe the future to him, but not in the future to us? Or is he describing the future well off, even far in the future than us? Well, it could be. I mean, normally that's not the intention of a writer. Now, what's great about Scripture, and this has to do with biblical interpretation, is that even though Daniel might be describing a certain period of time, and let's just say here for the sake of argument, there are similar things about that time that could be applicable to another time, and so then these things might also be true as well. So to your answer, I mean, I think that's probably what you were getting at. But most of the biblical writers have a certain audience and a certain purpose for why they're writing. That's right. It's for insiders. So there's a part of the Bible that is, and that's where interpretation, I mean, that's where there's a ton of denominations. That's where there's a lot of struggles inside the church, is because there are some aspects that are very much to that particular time, and they're not transferable to any other time, right? There's some that are transferable. I mean, they are for that particular time, and they are transferable to another time, within reason, because it has similar characteristics, right? And then there's some that really aren't written to a certain time per se, as much as it's general, universal principles like, love your neighbor, things like that. That's to any time period, regardless of context. So the struggle with interpretation is, is this strictly here, or is it strictly here or here? I'm okay with people interpreting it as strictly here, but there are tenets that apply to any period of time where this might be applicable. And if that's the case, then we draw upon the same thing as Daniel. That's part of it is because we believe that the scriptures are inspired by God. And with that, God, it's not so much the black ink on the white page that is what's really important. It's what God does with the black ink on the white page when someone reads it through the Holy Spirit that makes application to our life. You with me? All right, so I know we got like about 10 balls in the air, all right? So, that's what makes this style of writing, really juicy to study, but at the same time, it's pack a lunch because, it's sort of like holding sand sometimes at the beach. You pick up some sand and you think you got it all under control. Next thing you know, you squeeze a little bit more and some of it leaks out. So to Joyce's comment, I think there is value in, like even in the Old Testament, so much of the Old Testament, I'm not talking about the prophets, I'm talking about the historicals. They're written at a time that just describe the history of the Israelites. Well, on one level, you could read it and say that has anything to do with us because he's describing this king or that person or whatever, and that person's long gone and dead. And okay, that's fine, but I think to do that, you limit the purpose of what God designed for the scriptures, because even that can speak to us in a way that where it can be applicable to our life. It's not going to be the same characteristics, right? But there is, it does touch some things that are transferable to any time and place, right? So that's why we study the scriptures, and and that's why we also. It's not just that we want to study for what it says; we want to study for what it says, but then how that can be applied to our own life. So for instance, if you read, King Solomon, this guy's been long dead for a long time. Are any of y'all rulers? Well, it might not be quite as applicable, right? But no, you can look at some of the things that Solomon did and go, okay, those were good. So let's harness that. God, you work in us to create that as well. But some of this stuff was very poor. So we want to stay away from that. Lord, help me not to go down that same road. Or Joshua 1. It's going to be the text for Sunday. Be strong and courageous. Well, on one level, that has nothing to do with us because we're not about to go into the promised land. So we can actually take out those direct, Joshua's direct context, his situation, but there might be situations that are similar that we face. Well, if that's the case, then God's same words to Joseph can be the words that he says to us. Have resolve, stand fast, trust in me. And if you trust in me, you'll find me walking with you. All right? Good? Maybe not? Y'all ready for a break? All right, let's take a break for about 10 minutes and let some of this sort of sink in, and we'll see what comes out of it. All right, I'm good now. All right. So let's go ahead and come on back. We have a few minutes. So what Kay read for us was, you saw, of course I erased it, but you saw how whoever this person is, that there's obviously master of intrigue, has some level of power. It's limited for a time. The text even says his death is not by human hands. Basically means that another person didn't kill him. And so you see whether it be describing the Antiochus or an Antichrist or the Antichrist, you see those tenets of the type of person. But one of the undercurrents of all this is, what do we make, what do we do with this idea of those that were in rebellion? And the context, I think, is fairly clear. He's describing Daniel's people. Obviously there's levels of anti-God with the ruler and the people that back the ruler, but before the ruler even takes the reins, Daniel, or at least the angel, described that with verse 12, then obviously with verse 23 and verse 24, that there's some level of either sin, disobedience, or whatever it may be, by the people who would be either holy or listed as saints in the passage. All right, you with me? So that raises are we okay with that? Okay, all right, good. Yep, so, we got 25 more minutes. So, so if that's the case, then this raises a question when it comes to judgment. And because one of the conclusions that we could draw from this passage, that did all this take place because the people rebelled? Because when we look at some of the other prophets, not just Daniel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and even the minor prophets, when they're either describing the northern kingdom captivity, where the Assyrians annihilated the 10 tribes in the north, or the whole Babylonian captivity in the first place, by the prophets was constant warnings of, we need to sort of get right. We need to live a certain way. We don't need to live in disobedience, because if we're not careful, then something's going to happen. So what do we make of that? Don't rebel. Yeah, that's the easy answer. Okay, yeah. So don't rebel. All right, let's stand for the benediction. You got it, Kay. You nailed it. So, but if there is rebellion, or if there is sinfulness, whatever, what's the correlation with judgment and sinfulness? Because the next thing's going to be, why do bad things happen? And when you peel this onion back, just be careful. You're going to peel for a while. So, what do you say when either your children or your grandchildren come up to you and, John 9. What do they call you? Grandmother? Grandma? Mimi? Mimi, whose sin caused this? His sin or his parents? Talking about the guy that was blind, begging on the side of the road with pencils. See, y'all thought we were just going to ease back into Daniel, didn't you? It's like right into the deep waters of the, You don't?
I can remember my oldest daughter had a brain tumor.
Mm-hmm.
And we had gone home to see Mom and Daddy. And Aunt came. And she said, well,
Sure.
a child in a range of
Well, and that question's asked all the time. Yes, I mean, so your own personal stories, very similar to other stories, and I mean, so some of this is how do we reconcile the two? Because there are a couple of things that some major tenets, major theological themes that are in the Old Testament and in the New Testament that are, how do you reconcile them? One is the wages of sin are what? Exactly right. And that's fairly clear, Old Testament, New Testament, right? So there is some level of the effects of sin lead to death, right? Would you agree? Maybe, maybe not. So, okay, well, I'm not talking about personal sins, okay? So let me clarify. The wages of capital S sin leads to death. Would we agree to that? So Genesis 3. Remember that? All right, Genesis 1 and 2, creation. Genesis 3, in the garden, Adam and Eve. What happened? What's the result from God? Exactly right. It says you will actually die. It actually says you will die. Don't eat this because you will die. And there's separation. So whether we haven't gotten to personal, but just the capital sin in general does lead to some level of death, right? If not, then why Jesus? Okay? So at least on some level, Old Testament, New Testament, capital sin, big sin does lead to death. It gets more complicated when it becomes personal. And then is it a one-to-one correlation? So how do you answer it? Do we say, well, the little boy asked whose parents, or the disciple asked Jesus, whose parents caused this guy to be blind, his sin or his parents' sin? Jesus actually dodged the answer. I don't know if y'all noticed that in the passage. It says some things happen and the glory of God can be manifested in things. And go back and read John chapter 9. He really doesn't answer the question per se. He talks about the goodness of God and how really gives you a little bit into the concept of whole miracles. But he really doesn't answer it. So, because we do have in Daniel chapter 8, verse 12, verse 23, verse 24, I would argue it's fairly clear because of rebellion, because of disobedient for a period of time with the saints, that would be Daniel's people, there is some level of judgment that comes. All right? When we get into chapter 9 next week, it gets even really good because the very beginning of chapter 9, Daniel is all stressed out because in Jeremiah 25, Jeremiah described the Babylonian captivity. And he talked about it in a term of 70 years. Well, the 70 years are coming to an end. So this appointed time is coming to an end. Daniel's an old man, so he's lived throughout all of it. And so it launches him into just this long prayer of, "Oh Lord, let it come to an end." Now, what he gets is not that, because then he has another dream, and the angel says, "Well, that 70's over, but, we'll hold that to next week." But we do have to reconcile in some form or fashion, how does big sin equal death? What's the correlation of personal disobedient or whatever? Is that a one-to-one correlation to either bad things or judgment? And if so, is God the cause of it, or does God just allow it to happen because that's the way the world operates?
I think he allows things to happen. What about that thing that we learned from C.S. Lewis about God gave us choice?
Look at you, Kay. You're trying to trump the other K, right, for reading. I mean, gold star number 2, right? So to quote Shane's favorite book, The Problem of a Pain, right? Look at you. That's impressive. Yeah, so then again, you've raised another issue. You know, what we haven't mentioned, but in all of this, how does free will and personal choice come into play? And so just so I can see your faces, I'll tell you where I sit, and I hope you might or might not agree. Big sin equals death, whole purpose of Jesus Christ. Because in Jesus' death and resurrection, big sin is taken care of. And you see the goodness of God so that death is not the final issue, right? At the same time, I don't think when you justify or when you try to reconcile the larger major themes of the Bible that you can get to the idea that God causes judgment to sin one-to-one correlation. But there is a consequence for actions that God does not remove. And in the Old Testament's view of a sovereign God, it's hard not to talk about the sovereignty of God and then also say that all things sits under his feet, even judgment. I mean, the Bible just doesn't give us that answer of explanation to where we would love for the writer to say, hey, now, there is judgment for the big S, but this is really not what's going on here. God allows personal consequences, things of that nature, you know, and they are living into their consequences over and over and over and over and over. And it just pretty much says God is the author of it all. So when we draw that conclusion, we have to draw that conclusion with all the other large biblical themes. And, you know, and sometimes it's, you know, it's like putting a puzzle together. Sometimes it doesn't always fit as quite nicely as we want it. You with me?
I get that God forgives us.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And we ask. And then what I am somewhat sketchy on is, then when we die, we face judgment.
Mm-hmm.
But if we've asked forgiveness for all those sins, do we still have some bigger sins that weren't forgiven, and we still got to see whether we're going to stay up there?
Yeah, so
I'm just asking.
in Ephesians, it actually uses a past tense verb that God has already judged the world. And so all of this has already been judged by God, but it's seen through the lens of Christ. So upon forgiveness, you know, if you're forgiven, then what do you need to be judged for? Does that make sense? That's right, yeah. So, you know, what we have to resist, I would argue, is that this one-to-one correlation, and so then it has to also be one-to-one correlation with forgiveness. I had 10 sins today. I need to be forgiven 10 times, right? Tomorrow, maybe it's a good day. I only have one sin. I need to be forgiven one time. Friday's a horrible day. I got 40 sins, so I need to be forgiven 40 times. You know, if you take, so turn to Romans chapter 1. And this is a pivotal book, one, and then a really important passage in Romans. This is actually the whole purpose. This is the whole, you know, this is the theme of the book of Romans. Romans 1, verses 16 and 17. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is what? The power of God for what? To everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also the Greek, which means that's an inclusive phrase. Jews and Greek are how the New Testament divided people. Then look at verse 17. This is the reason why that's accurate. For in it, that being the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteousness shall live by faith. What Paul is saying is that the righteousness of God is revealed through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. And through your faith in Jesus Christ, you receive Jesus' righteousness, which is salvation. So, Easter eggs. We have Easter egg hunt right here. And every kid wants to find what? The golden egg. Because what is in the golden egg? All kind of good money, whatever, I guess whatever Grace loads it up with, right? So if, pardon the analogy, this is the golden egg. Christ, golden egg. We are in the golden egg, so everything that is the golden egg, that's ours. And as Paul said, that the righteousness of God is revealed in the faithfulness of Jesus. And when we believe, we are transported, grant me the word, into the egg. And so everything that Jesus is, that's who you are. Which means then for this discussion, big S and little s is forgiven. Yeah, you like it better than Daniel, right? Yeah, so everybody likes the New Testament more than the book of Daniel, right? So, I mean, well, actually, we like Daniel 1 through 6. 7 through 12, we're just kind of waiting to May. I know what we're doing, so, and we can blame who? Smile big, Mimi. She wanted, no, I'm just kidding with her. I've toyed around with her on Thursdays. So if that's the case, then, and when you balance like free will and personal choice, and then yet God's trump card, even something like allowing consequences to play out, still can be seen through the lens of Jesus. Because it's not forever. But life has told us, and the Bible attests to this, or either way around, the Bible tells us and life attests to it, that people are not absolved of their consequences. Even something like a miracle. A miracle is not the norm. It's the abnormal. And it's where God pauses the normal workings of the world for something different, but then the normal comes back. So, everybody that was healed in the New Testament, they're still living today, right? Lazarus, if there's anybody should be living, he got some special juju, right? So, still dead. So, it's the suspension of the norm for a period of time. And that shouldn't be upsetting, because this is the real miracle. So in 1 Corinthians, where Paul, the final struggle is death. And you've got that poetic language, where, O death, is your sting? Where, O grave, where is it? It's gone. But thanks be to Jesus, he's overcome, he overcame it. And because we're in him, then we overcome. And that's the gospel. Now, if you really want to get good, you can read into James chapter 1, verses around 12-ish, where it talks about God being the giver of good gifts, the Father of lights. It says, it's a play. James is playing with the congregation around wisdom by saying, don't ascribe to God things that are not God's. Temptation, trials, things of that nature. Said God, those actually have have sort of a connotation of leading to sin. So that God forbid, right? And the reason why is because He's a giver of good gifts. Right. And you see that here. So even like in Jeremiah, I think it might even be chapter 25, there are 3 times where the prophet says, you have broken the covenant. But there are 4 times that the prophet says, but He remembers the covenant. And He will not forsake you. So even these passages, if we just hone in on one tiny passage inside of the larger story, then yeah, we really get this. 1-to-1. But when you see it inside of the larger thrust of the Bible, then, not so much. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't consequences for people's actions. I mean, if you walk out, to quote C.S. Lewis, if you take a bat and go to hit somebody next to you, God's not going to magically make it a pillow. It still will be a bat. So some of that's the natural workings of the world, the way it's been hardwired. But in spite of capital S and even, in lowercase s, this still applies. And for that, may God be praised. All right? Any last, final questions, comments, worries? It's probably enough, isn't it? Yeah, it's like, oof. Next week, let's go to the gospel, right? We'll pause Daniel and then, because, chapter 9 is even better. Goodness me. All right. So anyway, go in peace. May the Lord be with you. The reason why chapter 9 is difficult, it's not tied to a certain time period. It's hard. It could be 4 different time periods because it doesn't have a historical marker like some of the others do. Joyce, you say something to me? I'm sorry. Yeah, it's 9's just interesting, man. It's all over the place. So, now there's been hundreds that have come through our orphanages, all right? But we know of at least 6 that have died in the war that were actually our kids. They would have grown up with St. Paul. So just kind of I know for some of us, we're a year into it, so it's not as fresh as what it was, say, this time last year. But it is, the city that our orphanages are in has been spared a lot of the bombing, but now the bombing is starting to come. So just be mindful of them, please.